Thanks for coming out. My name is Brian Miracle. I am a distinguished engineer at Choice Hotels. I have moved to the Dallas area back in May. Our main IT operations is in Phoenix, Arizona. So now I'm remote, working from home, and doing lots of Jenkins. So this talk is about managing Jenkins through code, through some of the plugins that are available to help basically codify your jobs and your execution of your jobs. I know it's a pretty silly title, but one thing that's interesting about this slide deck is that there's no lowercase in the title. So it really should be a small a up there, but as much as I could, it wouldn't work. So that's my lovely face. I have quite many years of experience in software engineering. Last few years, I've been basically doing a lot of IT leadership, and most recently into the CI/CD space. And so my love of Jenkins has gone back way before it was Jenkins, back in the Hudson days. But ultimately, this platform, this tool has been one of my favorite tools for the past decade. So I really enjoy doing this work. It gets me up early in the morning and it gets me excited. Over the last, I want to say, year, I've been working mainly with Jenkins pipelines. And now since the declarative model came out this year, I've been working mostly with that. Over the last 6 months, I've been doing a lot of work with Jenkins as code. And so what I want to do today is sort of walk through a little bit of what that means. This is going to be I want to say a high level. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of details that you could sort of get sunk into, but with an hour, I wanted to sort of cover the basics and then hopefully lead into some questions. My goal is to do as least amount of slides as possible with the most amount of demo. So one thing that I'll just prefix this with is if you've never created a presentation and presented it in front of people, you've witnessed lots of demos, and they're always really simple. And you're like, well, that's so silly. Why am I doing such a simple demo? I could do something more fantastic, more eye-popping. It's really hard to do that with not understanding the level of skill in the audience. You don't want to go too far down one way because somebody might not understand those concepts. So this particular agenda is meant as a really kind of a high-level intro into this. I hope to do more advanced topics a little later, maybe in future presentations. But this is really just to give you a taste, give you this sort of ammunition to start looking at this yourselves. Just real quick, who currently is using the Job DSL plugin to codify their Jenkins? Nobody. Not one person. All right. Huh? No, this is the Job DSL plugin from the core Jenkins CI GitHub. You too? Okay. They actually, interesting, I have a little bit of history a little further, but ultimately I just wanted to get a sense of who's tried this before, who's doing some of the things. It looks like you guys will all be new to this and benefit a little bit from some information. So basically what this means per se is, how do I, the typical use case and typical user of Jenkins goes through the user interface. They log in, they have some permissions, hopefully you have some security set up, otherwise it's open and free, but you have some interface where you can create jobs to pretty much do anything you want. There are plugins up, for as far as I can see about how you can interact with any type of programming language, any type of infrastructure, whatever it may be that you're doing is pretty much possible with Jenkins. And so what we're trying to do with this concept of programmatic usage is, how do I tap into this as an API? How do I put something together that can be reusable, that can be reviewed and basically approved for use, that people can not have to worry about the thousands of manual jobs that someone's created out there that are just clones of each other. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this. You make one job, or a developer makes a job, someone else comes along and says, I like that job, I want to add one more thing to it. So they clone it and add one more thing. But there may be some base logic that just gets stuck in Jenkins. And it's if that's a change, then you have to spend a lot of time figuring out, okay, what jobs do I have to go modify to update this core logic. With code, it's easier to find and easier to test and reproduce. I love this meme. This is done for a lot of different things, but ultimately, if you are in an enterprise organization and you're using Jenkins, most likely you have thousands of jobs, hundreds of jobs, and they can become really unwieldy. It depends on what your organization sort of is structured, how you support Jenkins in this way. You may have an engineering or release engineering team that is in charge of it. Maybe you're completely open and every developer can do anything they want in it. It's so flexible that you can pretty much run the full gamut of from as tightly secure as it can be to completely open. And ultimately, it's so easy to use that people don't necessarily think about the long-term effect of doing certain things like cloning a job and changing it underneath the hood. So when I am talking about this sort of programmatic approach, what I'm really talking about is this job DSL and plugin. And so I want to sort of make a distinction between these two things because they are slightly different, but they really worked well together. There are probably many other plugins that do something similar to this one. This one actually was brought over to Jenkins from the Java Posse Roundup. So anybody ever heard of that before? Java Posse Roundup? These guys, there's like 4 of them, I believe, that started this back in 2005, but they basically created their own conference, very intimate conference about Java and Java technologies, and it's sort of like an unconference where you'd go and people would tell them what topics they would like to hear about, and people would opt to basically tell them about those things. But they sort of disbanded. They also had a podcast, a couple of different conferences they started. They sort of disbanded around 2011 and sort of donated this project to the base Jenkins CI and GitHub. But ultimately, the DSL basically is, if you haven't heard that term, domain-specific language. So in this case, you need something that you can script against in order to make this interaction happen. And the way this is supported is through a scriptable Groovy-based DSL. So when I say Groovy-based, it's Groovy is a language that's basically that runs on the JVM, and it's really very close to Java. You can have typed or untyped variable types, but ultimately it is Groovy, but not fully Groovy. There are ways to do things that you would normally do with the Groovy API, but there is some little bit of a difference between what you can typically write in Groovy and what you can do through here. What this allows, though, is it gives this functional way to interact with the Jenkins under the hood. It can basically, if you're familiar with configuration, how the configuration is represented in Jenkins for a job, it's through an XML file, right? If you go to job/config.xml, there's what is your representation of what this job is doing, and it's just an XML file based off of just the types of things that you've put in there. This plugin or this DSL allows you to modify and to interact with that XML file through API, and so it's really a way to have full access to what you can do with the XML file. If I took that XML file, copied it somewhere, and changed a few things and put it back into somewhere else, in some other job, I would get the same configuration. So I basically lay this out as to say that you can do anything that the Jenkins core can do, you can do through DSL, with some caveats, and I'll get to those a little later. Basically, there's also a lot of functions and a lot of steps that are provided for you out of the box. So if you configure a job, you go down to the build steps. There's a ton of different things you can pick from there, right? So some people pick, can do a shell command. They can do Maven command. Like all these things are available via plugins that you've installed on your Jenkins installation. There are functions though that are provided that come out of the box with this plugin that you can do. So reading in a file, reading a JSON file, reading an XML properties file, writing a file. Like you can do a lot of things that you'd have to typically use an I/O package to do. They provide steps and functions for you that you can automatically use to sort of help enhance what you're trying to write. So the DSL part of this is the scripting, the Groovy-like language that you use to define your Jenkins jobs and to interact with your Jenkins jobs. And then there's the plugin that actually can execute that work. So the plugin allows you to take this DSL script, create a job, and have it execute. So think about, and I'll show this as an example, but you have just a standard Maven build job. I can go in there and write my Groovy script that basically creates that job. I go into the Jenkins interface, create another job that basically takes that script and executes it. And then it creates whatever you've written it to do. So the plugin part helps you take what you've written in the DSL and actually have it be spit out as an actual Jenkins result. This also allows you to store your DSL in source code management. So typically, if you don't have that set up, you have your scripts or whatever they are inside the Jenkins job itself. Well, where is that? Where's the source for that? How do you know where the source of truth is? What version are you on? So one thing that you can get is a configuration history, usually with your Jenkins jobs. You can see over time what's gone from your first iteration to now. But trying to dissect what's changed through there and who owns what is really challenging if you don't have a version control system to help you manage it. So what this allows you to do is say, I'm going to take that work, I'm going to put it into a code repository that I can then review later. I can version it. I know exactly what state it's in. I can create tags from it. And I can basically be assured that when I'm creating my DSL job, it's pointing to an actual version that I know and trust. So the plugin really allows you to execute one-to-many, as many as you want, really, the DSL scripts. What's nice about it is you basically can then componentize your scripts. You can create, it's very flexible. You can create, if you wanted to create one Groovy script for one job, you can do that. If you wanted a Groovy script that has 3 jobs because they're all related, you can do that. It's very flexible, and it's really quite interesting to sort of work through. So I sort of mentioned this before. This comes off of their GitHub page, but basically it was forked from the Java Posse Roundup in 2011. There's been quite a few versions and releases, but there's been quite a number of contributors since 2011, 153. I think this is one of the plugins that's here to stay. It's been pretty well maintained. Oh, is it? Okay. Oh, you mean you're asking if they already were using it?
They did.
Oh, yeah, okay.
They were one of the Java Posse guys. They did it with Netflix.
Okay, cool. Oh, nice.
Really
Yeah, one thing about this is as I was doing this presentation, I was researching a little bit. There's a ton of presentations about this already. So the information is well out there, and ultimately, I'm just giving a very small hint at what's out there. But you walk away from here, don't fret. There's lots of information about how to make this stuff work and what it does. So one thing you might be asking, well, why would I do this? I'm fine with my Jenkins installation. I can configure it fine. I only got 2,000 jobs. That can't be that hard to maintain. There's a few things. There's also a little bit of the cons. But ultimately, what I like most about this approach is the fact that I can take my scripts, I can write tests against them, I can have them peer reviewed, and I can take part in the standard development lifecycle of my company that other people using for other projects. I like that control. I like the ability of getting input on things. You write a script, you write a program. If you write it by yourself, it could be great. But if you have people reviewing it and adding and sharing their knowledge, it can be really awesome. And so I'm really a fan of peer reviews and making sure that people have an understanding of what's happening and gleaning the information that I don't know. I know I don't know everything. I welcome knowledge from people who can give me additional tidbits that I don't know. One other thing you can do with this is I can create standard libraries that I can reuse and not have to worry about 3 different jobs doing a different version of this thing. Like if I need to read a JSON file, I can do it one way. And so it's really great for reusability. It's good for consistency. What's another kind of good point about this is when you create your job DSL job that executes the DSL, you can list one to many, right? So I can recreate my entire Jenkins with one file if I wanted to. Probably wouldn't want to do that though. Ultimately, it can be done in such a way where, say I've created three jobs. The third job I don't need anymore, so I just changed my DSL to not include it. You can configure the plugin to say, okay, if I'm going to re-execute the seed job that basically gives me my structure, I can choose to have anything that's not referenced anymore be deleted. And so one nice thing about that is how many Jenkins jobs are out there that you never run, don't know if they're run. They may be run once a year, or maybe somebody cloned it and never used it at all. With this kind of setup, you can easily keep your Jenkins completely clean if you have some responsibility and accountability to managing it this way. And you'll notice I add that as a con because I don't think every organization has dedicated people that support Jenkins. They're out there, definitely. There's definitely build engineering teams that manage this kind of stuff. But ultimately, if you're a smaller company, if you haven't quite matured in that way yet, like you have developers just making jobs and doing what they need to do to get their work done. And so who owns that job you just created? You? Well, you just moved on to another project, or you just moved on to a bigger, better deal, right? You won the lottery, awesome. Who takes that after you? Excuse me. There's ways that you can enhance the core sort of value sets that you get out of Jenkins itself. One thing that comes to mind is, if you're building a job, you have build parameters. You can pick. There's one called choice parameters, right? You can basically say, pick a drop down of these items. Well, if you're doing it through programmatic approach, now you're not constrained to just strings and text. Where do you get that information from? With the job DSL, you can actually create the content of those drop downs. If one example would be, I have a file that's hosted on my web server that I want to be able to extract out and get information from. Now I can write code that just does me a HTTP GET, gets that information and puts it into my drop down now, where it's not really easy to do that outside of using the DSL. You also can apply, by doing this, and you can obviously, if you create a job, you can also create permissions for that job. If you have AD or LDAP that you're using to authenticate your users, you can also take it a step further that you can authenticate the jobs. So maybe only operations can execute the jobs that are meant to be deploying to production. You don't want everybody having the ability to do that. So you can do that at the configuration level, but you also can do it at the code level too. Doing it at the code level will allow your InfoSec team or any other team that really cares about security could also review the code and make sure that things are working right, or things are set up correctly. Otherwise, you'd have to go into every single Jenkins job, perhaps, and check it if you don't have a global security sort of setup. Excuse me. So there's a lot of, these are just a few of the high-level benefits that I've personally found appealing. Some of the cons, there is a little bit of learning curve to DSL. It's another language in itself. If you are a Java guy, if you already know Groovy, you'll have less of an issue than other people. But ultimately, there is some nuance to it that will stump you sometimes. Luckily, there is a lot of information. Stack Overflow is your friend. Google is your friend. Don't hesitate to go out there. There's information is out there like crazy. And ultimately, the biggest thing I think that people will sort of knock this for is I can create a job in a minute, 2 minutes. Like, that's not hard to do. To do it this way, you're going to spend more time. But the goal that you're trying to to go towards is this long-term reusability, the security, the structure of having a defined definition will make it easier to maintain later, in my experience. And I mentioned before, like if you don't have people that are responsible for this stuff, who does the work? If you're in an organization that touts being a DevOps organization where anybody can do whatever, you're a very limited number of people, because usually you're at a company that only hires senior or principal engineers, like Netflix. But ultimately, there's got to be somebody who can be the person who can go in and fix the job or add a new one. And so there's a level of authority that you kind of need to impart on somebody to help do this work. One person can't do it if unless you have a small team. So here's a small hello world job DSL example. A few things I wanted to point out here. We'll go from top to bottom. While it's not necessary, the declaration up top is a best practice. It just gives the compiler a hint of what it's trying to do, or what kind of language it is. Every Groovy file that you create, just throw that in there. It doesn't hurt anybody. If it's not there, it's not going to complain about it. But just keeping a standard is always nice. So in this structure, you can think about these things. If you're looking at this from any other perspective, it looks like a function, right? And it has it's calling other methods within it. It's very analogous to that. The job structure is basically a DSL function that creates a new Jenkins job. You can set the display name. That's the name that you'll actually see in the user interface, whereas the name you give the job is what it will look like on the URL and on the file system. Obviously, the description you can give it. Here's an example of configuring your log rotator. So this is a way to say, I'm gonna, how many artifacts should I keep? How many days should I keep my logs? This is a shorthand to saying, so -1 means the sort of default, which is I don't know if it's set. It's not set at all. But so one's like the 5 is, I think they'll do 5 days worth of, or 5 builds, whereas the first argument would be like how many days do you want to do it. I find build numbers be a little more likely to be used. You have a parameter section. So here's everything that you would, if you want to do a parameterized job. This sort of encapsulated function gives you ability to add those things in. So here I'm just saying I have a string parameter with a name of name, no default value, and a description. If you're doing this, or if you're doing Jenkins in general, please put a description in the field. Like I mean, sometimes it's obvious. This is pretty obvious. But if it's not that obvious, a little description can go a long way. And then basically there's a set of steps. So steps would be like the build steps if you're looking at the user interface. So this one does a really simple, just echoes out the name that you put into the parameter. This is very simple, very simplistic. This can get way more complicated, but I wanted to start with this. So how about we jump into a demo? First, a little prerequisites. So what do you have to have in order to do this kind of work? Not very much. So you need the job DSL plugin installed. It's there under available. It doesn't come by default. So when you create a new Jenkins, if you start a new Jenkins installation, it's not going to be there. You have to go get it. The script names themselves, when you're creating these Groovy files, have to have a certain naming convention, which is letters, digits, and underscores. Can't start with a digit. And then you need a C job. You can name it whatever you like, but it's a job that says, I'm going to take your DSL, run it, and execute, and let's create what you told me to create. So those 3 things, you can pretty much get her done. So this first job is basically going to be the thing I just sort of showed you earlier. I'm going to go through and see it actually execute and what we have to do that. The first line there, check in your code and script, that's sort of obvious, but you need somewhere to put your code. You can execute DSL inline if you create this Jenkins job, but then if you're going to do that, why do it? I mean, you might as well create your jobs manually. So we're going to go create a seed job that brings that DSL down, execute the seed job, which will then create our job that we've told it to create, and then execute that job. So, can I? This is switching over to a weird place. All right, so one thing I did was, locally I'm running Docker, and so I just pulled down the latest 2.60.3 version on the Alpine. So I'm just going to run that real quick. I wanted to start off with nothing to sort of see what exactly you get out of the box and what you have to do to get there. I do have a backup plan in case the network doesn't go very fast. Because obviously, I think you did the same time last time, Eric, and it took a little while. This seems kind of weird. It's already done. What happened here? Oh, I have to say, that doesn't look right. There we go. This is taking a little. So I'm just going to start with the default installed plugins. You don't get any benefit from doing the other thing in this context because the job DSL is not there. So this is just bringing up a fresh Jenkins with the default plugins that comes with it. While this is happening, does anybody have any questions up till now? Yes?
So how does using DSL compare to like a Jenkins file?
So you can, Jenkins file in essence is just a naming convention for a Groovy file, like this, the Groovy script itself. You can do anything you can do in a regular Groovy file in this Jenkins file. But typically where you see Jenkins file comes in is when you're talking about pipeline. Or you can, I've seen a lot where people are building plugins with it as well. I've personally have only used it through building pipeline code. But ultimately, if I was to name it Jenkins file, it would execute no matter, as long as I'm referencing the full path to where it is, it would work just fine. But it does, the pipeline file, so the Jenkins file as a pipeline construct works very similarly how you would see the job DSL that I showed you. There's some structure to it. There's a, for a declarative pipeline, there's, it's a pipeline structure. And then there's, stages and then, stuff like that. I do have an example of a pipeline coming up here too with the Jenkins file, so we'll see that too. How are we doing on time? I meant to do my timer, but I didn't. Oh, it's 7:30 already. Oh, no, all right. I thought you were looking at your watch like, man, this guy's taking forever. This is taking forever. So I can go to my backup plan, which is already running Jenkins. So what I wanted to do, so I want to come over here to the seed job and show you what that is. We can even create a new one since I have it here. But let's pretend I'm creating it for the first time. You don't have to call it seed. I just do that to sort of indicate what type of job this is. So in my mind, a seed means I'm starting something from scratch. There's very minimal things you need in here. One is I need my source code repository URL, where to go get the DSL scripts. Right now, I do have all this code up in GitHub, so I'll have that link as part of this slide deck, and I'll post them in the Meetup later. So I have my repository URL, and then so what that's going to do is going to check out the source code locally to the workspace. And then this, when I do, I pick a build step, pretend that's not there. There is a process job DSLs option if you have the plugin installed. So you click that, and then it just gives you this feature here where you can pick, I can do an inline DSL script, or I can look for scripts on the repository. So here it is, I call out 3 separate Groovy files that all create a job in one way or another. And they're just, multi-line, full path to where those files would be in the workspace. There's some interesting options down here. Before I mentioned that you could have it so that if, say, I no longer reference a script, I modify this job to take out one of my scripts and no longer wants to create that job, I can say, hey, go ahead and delete that job that I no longer reference. You also can ignore it or disable it. So I would say if you are okay with unintended consequences, you might want to click delete. But a safe way would be to disable. Oh, yeah, sorry. Maybe.
Tracking from one run to the next, the jobs that it has.
Yeah, it keeps a history. Why is this not? Was it on the browser page? Of course, this is, I don't know how much helpful this is. It's really hard to see this all the way over here. Anyway. Oh, gee, come on. Oh, I'm not really going to do this well. Anyway, okay, so basically there's a couple actions you can set here. One is I can ignore missing files. So if I put a reference to a file name that's not there, it won't complain. But why would you want to do that? You probably want to know if something's not there. You can, I'll get to this Groovy sandbox in a second. You also can ignore changes, so it would only do additive stuff. So if you wanted to do it so that it would just create anything new that was there, you could do that as well. Or you can, and then you can change. You can sort of select how you want to handle things like remove jobs or remove views or config files. So I like to run it clean, but I'm also, I think once what I'm doing is going to grow in usage, I'm probably going to not want to do that. Actually, I screwed up today and took down a pipeline job that someone was doing to production. But all I did is rerun the seed job, and it came right back. So that was one good thing about that. I did not intend for that to happen necessarily, but it was easy to bring it back. So that's really great, because it doesn't keep any. There's almost now. One thing that will happen is that you lost all of the local history, but hopefully you're not relying on Jenkins to be your source of truth for that. That stuff should be held in other things like an artifact repository or somewhere else. But yeah, so you have different options for how to handle changes to the jobs that are encountered. You also can reference things either relative to the root of Jenkins or to where you deploy the seed job itself. So say I had a 2-folder nested structure and my seed job is at that level, I can refer to it local from where that job is when I'm writing the DSL. I just keep it as root for now. And I typically like to mimic the structure that I'm creating in Jenkins in my source code repository too, so that it's a sort of one-to-one correlation. My seed job will be so right now my seed job at the root would have a seed.groovy file, and basically would maybe create 2 or 3 different folders or whatever I wanted to put there. This file, everything is just at the root. So everything that gets created at the root of Jenkins. There's also this little couple of checks to help you realize if things are not right. Like say you brought in a DSL script that references a plugin that you don't have. You'd want to know about it when you execute it. So there's really some good controls around how to act with changes and make sure that you don't inadvertently do something that will be broken. So you'll see here, I can't even read that. What does that say? Leave page, okay. So I've run this a few times, but ultimately I'll just build it again. So one thing you'll see here is it goes out and runs, pulls down the Jenkins, the DSL from GitHub, and then it knows that I've already processed these guys, so it'll kind of give you an indication of what it processed, and then what jobs were created, and tell you basically what happened. An interesting thing about this is this also will show you what it generated at the top level of C2. So it gives you a really good high indication of what it did. And so you obviously can click on any of these to go into right into those jobs, and it uses the display name if you provided it as the name of the job. So let's go over here and look at, so this is the first one I created. This job was created based off that example I showed you guys at the very beginning, where you just basically it has one parameter, you pass in a name and just echoes it out. So if you look at the configuration, those couple lines of code basically did everything you would normally do in the Jenkins interface. My name, my description, log rotation stuff, the parameter, and then the execute shell command that I put into code. Oh my gosh, already lit. So then you can go ahead and just run that. And it does something completely useless. It just says, hello, DFW. All right. I practiced that, and it didn't work out the way I wanted to do. Let's see how we're doing over here. I want to show this because this is something that I ran into that it was interesting. So let me just go ahead and this is going to be a pain in the butt. I find it that if I do install without restart, it doesn't really do what I want it to do. But it starts pretty quickly usually. Did I restart? There it is. I promise there's a reason why I'm going to go through this. But if I don't get to anything else, you'll see this will be helpful to you. While I'm waiting, I will go to here. Of course, then I forget my apologies. This is not the way I wanted it to go. This is really weird having it all the way over here. Okay, so let me go ahead and just create this C job real quick. It's just a regular freestyle job. All right, suffering from the lag. Just so I don't I can't even see that. Why is I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. The C job, why am I building it? Oh, because I was showing you, I already had one running because I didn't know if the Wi-Fi was going to work right. No, it's going to be the same thing, but there's something I wanted to show. I really wanted to show you guys because it would be helpful later on. All right. And I'm just going to do this for now. So, say you get the job DSL plugin, you're ready to do your first seed job, and you execute it, and then this happens. It fails. Script not yet approved for use. Oh man, what does that mean? So this is this is what's supposed to happen. So you get this error. You're like, I don't understand what's going on here. So there's reasons why there are security around these scripts, right? If you open up completely, you can manipulate Jenkins in ways it probably wasn't meant to be, and you can do some malicious things. So they introduced this sort of this way to put some approval around what you actually get to execute on the behalf of Jenkins. So there's basically 3 options that I'm aware of how you can handle this. One is you need somebody who's an administrator to go in and approve all the scripts. You only have to approve it once, and it basically then becomes a whitelisted script, and then it can execute. However, the next time you change it, it'll ask you to approve it again. So that's really kind of cumbersome. It's not flexible. Someone's a bottleneck at that point, unless you're the admin yourself, which is you can go do it. But there's a lot of things that you have to be there doing that all the time, which is not really great. The second is this idea of Groovy sandboxing. So there are white labeled operations out of the box that you can execute against, and the ones that are not need approval. And so there is a way that you can, there's another plugin that you can install called the Authorized Project plugin that you can, it basically says, I need to know what user I'm allowed to execute this script as. And there's some options in there. That one is the person running the job, or an administrator, or a system. You can set it at a global level. You can set it at a project level. The way I have it set up on here was through this Groovy sandboxing approach. And then obviously the last thing you do is you can completely disable it, which while it's really makes your time go a lot faster, at some point you probably want to re-enable that thing again so that people who are contributing don't necessarily do bad things. So basically, I'm not going to do that over here. I'm going to show you that over here. So this Jenkins installation has all those plugins installed. If I go to Configure Global Security, this is with the Authorized Project plugin. You'll see down here there's a little thing called Access Control for Builds, and you can do multiple rules as well. But the first option you get is, should I do it per project or should it be as a default? And so what I've set just for this demo is just run as the user who triggered the build. And because I am an admin, it would work. Otherwise, what you have to do, if you were to do it manually, you have to go to Manage Jenkins all the way down to the bottom, and there's a in-process script approval. And if you're an admin, you get this view. And basically, you can say, I'm going to allow it or deny it. And so if someone denies it, then good luck. Maybe you can buy them a drink and he'll approve it for you. But ultimately, an administrator has to look at this and say, okay, is this doing anything harmful? No. Okay, I can approve it. And then once you approve it, it basically goes away, and you can now execute that thing. So the net effect is, if you run into this problem, you will fail, you get it approved, and you run it again, and it works perfectly fine, as long as your syntax is all correct. So I'm gonna do a time check. It's 7:45. I have 2 more demos I could do, but I can probably just end after this one.
You're fine. Like I said, I don't have a full review for Jenkins File.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. So, obviously at a very high level, it's hard to get into a lot of detail. But if you're interested in well, first, we talked a little bit about this last time too. But pipelines, anybody using them? Cool. Awesome. Scripted versus declarative. Who's doing declarative? All right, some of you. So declarative just came GA this year, at the beginning of the year. It really provides a really great structure around how to define your pipelines. You can do the very similar things with the scripted pipelines, which it works just as well. It gives you a little more of a definition you can work through and some standards around those naming conventions. But ultimately, pipelines are really just workflows that are sequential or parallel in nature that trying to do the thing that you want it to do against the code or the artifact that you're trying to do it with. It's just really broken into a set of stages that can do any number of steps in them that you want. It gives you a sort of a workflow type view that you can really sort of take operations that are really are like together, group together, and put them into a organization that basically bundles them all together into these sequential stages. And you can do the declarative model or through the scripted model, which is just the Jenkins file usually is associated with the declarative model, but you can use it for other things as well. This is something that is really got me, and it continues to bite me every once in a while. But basically, the pipeline plugin that uses Groovy underneath the hood does not have full access to Groovy itself. It has to be whitelisted, so you can't just manipulate everything that you would want to. And so there's just this style of programming, continuation passing style, which basically, if you're familiar with callbacks or Lambda functional programming, where you can pass in a function as a parameter to another method that can be called as a result of the actions of that one method, it's very similar to that, where basically Jenkins itself uses this Groovy interpreter and intercepts these Groovy calls and puts basically a nice warm blanket around it and tries to protect Jenkins itself. So it limits things like everything that you're using in your scripts have to be serializable, because basically when you're dealing with a pipeline, it writes state to underneath the hood every time it has asynchronous actions happening, which pretty much is the whole time. So that is how it's able to, if say you're running a pipeline and Jenkins goes down, when it comes back up, as long as your slave node was still there, it'll still be executed. It'll resume its execution. But there are some things that you want to use in the Groovy language that would prevent you from using it out of the box. So there is a way using this non-CPS annotation. You can declare a function to be non-CPS, and it'll use the actual Groovy interpreter behind the scenes, but it's then subject to approval. So these things would be like using the each. There's a way that you can use iterate over collection using like collection.each, and then do what you want to do in that thing. You can't do that unless you're doing it in a non-CPS annotated method. It's really, I wanted to throw this in here because this if you start doing this will come bite you, and then you'll be like, why? What's going on here? Like, this is something you should look into. I have links to all that information at the very end. But this is something that will bite you, and once you get the hang of it, it'll be okay. But ultimately, if you get these weird serialization issues, it's most likely because you have a variable that's not serializable. And there's usually like collections, like some abstract lists. There's some things in Groovy that are not serializable. So this is basically the pipeline. This is the example of a pipeline. I know it's kind of small, but it fits into the format of the other job. It has a name, display, description, log rotator, parameters. This is where it gets different, is how you define a pipeline to be executed with the pipeline job plugin, which is what this represents, is through this definition loveliness. So like, how are you ever going to know what all these options are? Well, good thing, Job DSL has an API viewer, and it has everything you would ever want. Like every single option that's available, it gives you examples of how to use it. It gives you examples of what the parameters are in there. So the API for using this is tremendous. So you won't be lost for the most part if you know very high level things like what kind of job you're trying to write. It goes through and says exactly what's available and what each thing is. So, and there's lots of examples out on the web too, all this stuff. But ultimately, I've pinned the API viewer to my browser. It's part of my experience. It works. It really is a good way to have that sort of ability to know what's available, what's even possible, and how to actually do it. So all this is really doing is declaring I have a CPS source code management section. I'm going to connect to a Git repo with a remote URL of that variable name, which I've defined up top, what the branch name is, and then what the path to that script is. And so, it's a way for us to really define this in a simple kind of way. Yeah. Look over here for this. So I already ran this. It ran this Hello World pipeline, created this project. If you look in there, configure, it has all the loveliness that it did before. Here's my name parameter. And then because this is a pipeline job, it knows what options, configuration options are available to me. And so it automatically pulls up this different thing that you wouldn't normally see on a freestyle job. But it's from a source code management, using Git, use the URL, I provided it, and the branch, and then the script path to what it is. And this is the Jenkins file. So let me just real quick show you that Jenkins file. Of course, this is going to be. So I could make a more simple. I could just use one. Should just use one stage probably, but then you can give the essence of a continuous level of work. But ultimately, this is a declarative pipeline model. Lots of documentation on that too. I have lots of links to the end. But basically, just breaking this down, this is like I'm declaring a pipeline. I'm going to say I don't want to use any agents, which means I'm running on master. If I have slaves running, I can have them grouped by or labeled with certain names. I can provide that name here, and then it'll run on those whatever slave has that label. There's a few options you can do. I typically like to put timestamps on my pipeline, so I know exactly when what happened where. And then the definition of what these stages. So there's basically stages, and then you go into each stage. So this first stage, build stage, you could think of whatever. I'm a Java guy. I do Maven a lot. This is where you do your Maven compilation, your unit test, your sonar, all aspects of what you would want to do for a build perspective of that artifact. And then, so these steps are basically what's available. There's some common functions. So like, echo is a common Groovy function that you can use that basically under the hood just does an sh echo command, but it sort of does a shorthand for this. So I was just printing out, some building project, whatever. You'll realize that, when I'm referencing parameters, so this job has a name parameter. How I reference that inside here is just using the sort of the term is an interpolation way of dollar sign, squigglies, braces, and then the name of the parameter. You also can use there's a global variable called params that you could use. It's basically a map. So you could do params.name, and that'll give you the same thing. But everything that you get passed into the pipeline that's a parameter or environment variables becomes an environment variable to the script, so you can use it. So then there's this concept of what can you do after the stage is run. So there's this concept of a post, which basically says at the end of the run of the stage, the build has some result, right? It's going to be successful, failure, boarded, whatever the Jenkins status is. It'll basically be represented by a named status, and this is what you can provide here. So if I said aborted, I just use all lowercase aborted. If I say not built, it'll be not underscore built, all lowercase. But it knows basically do this action as a result of the result of this stage. If I don't provide this post section, nothing, it just doesn't do anything. But this allows you to capture successes or failures at the end of the stage, and then you can do something as a result of that. One thing I usually do is I always have an always here, and so I always clean up after myself. I don't necessarily want to keep I don't necessarily know what slave node my stage is going to run on, so I don't want to rely on data being stored locally. So I write my data out to a S-read bucket or something like that, and then I can maintain state across my pipeline external of Jenkins. So if Jenkins goes down, my save goes down, I don't lose my data. So just going all the way down, you had 2 other stages. And then you have this sort of post thing at the result of the end of the pipeline too. So the pipeline ends in a success or failure, you can do some specific thing as a result. So basically, let's go ahead and execute this bad boy. Pick on Eric. So right now, this is all going to run on master, which is you don't typically want to do. You want to create slave instances so that you don't tie up master if you can't help it. So right now, this is just running through. It's not very exciting. Prints out what it's doing, then sleeping for 5 seconds, just to give some kind of indication of things happening. So that's already done. And it basically says this success, the blue ball of success. All right. I have one more example that, if you guys, I don't know who doesn't have time, but I have one more example that shows how to use libraries instead of inline. Okay. So the second example I have basically it's really the same thing, but instead of inlining all the steps that you would do inside of your Jenkins file, why not create a library that you can reference that you can reuse, right? So maybe you want to do the same kind of build for 3 different pipelines in the build stage, but why duplicate all that code 3 different times? Extract it to a global function, and then you can be able to reference it from as many pipelines as you want or other DSL code. So this basically is set up the same way as the other pipeline was, except one little change. So the only difference between this pipeline job that I created and the last one was the reference to this Jenkins file. That's the only difference. Everything else is exactly the same. But this Jenkins file is slightly different in that it refers to a library. So as you remember before, I had this echo statement and then a sleep. Now I have a call to a global function that does those 2 things. And so obviously a very simplified example, but basically this allows you to encapsulate, to basically create your pipeline as a template and then change out what the underlying thing does for those stages. So maybe it makes sense that 3 different types of projects have 3 different types of pipelines, but they can reuse the template and then just use a different function name. So how you create this function is fun. So one thing is there's like, where do you get this name from? Right now this is a global function that Jenkins has been defined to use. So let me show you where that definition lies. So when you create a global function, you do it from the configure system section. There's a section called global pipeline libraries. If you have well, actually, it's out of the box. You'll have this because it now comes with defaultly with Jenkins. But you have global pipeline libraries, and basically what I did was I give it a name, and this can be any name you want, and then you give it a default version. So what this version can be is a branch name. It can be a tag name. Basically, it needs to be some reference from the source code repository where you're pulling this down from. But the one thing that's really nice is that you can allow the default version to be overridden. And so what this does, so as you saw in the this Jenkins file, I just referenced dsl-lib. Now, this, because of the way I've defined it in Jenkins in the system configuration, is going to pull down the master version. Say I'm working on a new version, a change to this. I'm going to add a new function or something. I can now, I'm already working in here. I can now just use at. I can't type it here. Yeah, idiot. You can type. I don't have it open. You can type at and then whatever that new version is, and then it'll use that instead. So it's really cool to say, okay, I'm gonna let everything else use master like it should, but then I can override it locally to do my testing, and then I can do my standard, SDLC stuff to get it back up to master, merge to master, and then maybe tagged. But ultimately, this allows you to change the versions of your libraries without having to affect everybody else who may be using them in your Jenkins installation. You'll notice this is, well, not really obvious, but this is in these brackets, which basically in Groovy is the list. And so this can take a list of libraries. So any library that you define in the system configuration, you can reference here, and any one you can add a version to or not add a version to, and you do it correctly. But so that's how you would use more than one library. But the library itself has to be set up in a certain way. So these are considered global functions. And so how that works is you have a source code repository that has, now I'll caveat this with, there's many ways to do this. This is the way I've chosen to go about doing it. There's this vars folder that basically is there to encapsulate global functions that you can call, just like you saw in the Jenkins file. There's also things you can create your Groovy classes in the source tree that can encapsulate certain information, and you can be more object oriented about this process. I choose to be more functional. So in this vars directory, I have a number of functions, and these functions are just some name.groovy. So the very first thing in there was execute build stage steps. Now there's no naming convention for these as long as they're a Groovy file that can be executed, except wherever you name it is what the global function name will be. So that's the only thing caveat. I like to be very explicit with what I'm trying to do, so I've named it pretty clearly what it should be encapsulate. And then basically there's this def call, which basically is required. You can pass in parameters to it if you want to. I don't have any at this point, so I didn't pass anything in. And all it does is the echo and the sleep like it did before, but now I've encapsulated it into a library that I can mess with and not worry about the Jenkins file at the end of the day. Going the wrong one. Yes?
I assume you can return anything as well.
No. So there's nothing. Yes. Can you? Yes, you can, but how to say this right? You can pass in something. You can have it return something, but then you're doing more in the Jenkins file than I don't know that you would need to do. I don't know saying that right. How do I explain this? What was I doing? Over here. So say you're at the Jenkins file. And right here, you wanted this to return something, right? Definitely can do that, but you would have to be within a script block in order to do it, and then it just gets kind of wonky, right? Then you have all this extra stuff in here it just seems odd. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's not impossible to do that. What I like to do is encapsulate everything into one thing, and then I can do whatever I want another thing. But this encapsulates all the steps that I would need to do within a build. And you can do it other ways too. You could say, like, step 1, step 2. You could really break it down if you really wanted to. There's no limit to that. It's just a preference of mine to encapsulate everything into one function call. But yeah, you could do that. Like one thing, I'm obviously, I'm passing in a status here. It was really kind of strange. Like, shouldn't it know I'm in success? But because I'm in a pipeline, the status hasn't been set yet as success. But it knows, the stage knows it was successful. So I don't have a way, there's no default way I know to give it success unless I'm telling it what happened. So that's one of the weird thing to it. But ultimately, it's going to do the same thing. So. I know this is very high level, so I mean your experience will vary, and what you have to do is definitely going to vary. But there's tons of information out there as well. So hopefully you won't be too bad. And then I didn't have a cat in there, so I thought that went in. These are a small collection of resources that I use on a regular basis that will be really helpful. As I mentioned before, the Job DSL API viewer is awesome. And so that really can help you understand exactly what what you need to do and what's available to you to use. What's interesting is that, so the Job DSL, obviously, it does provides things that are default, but plugin providers can also tap into it. So they can also make themselves available to be used through the DSL. You also can do things that are strange. Not everything is available to you through the Job DSL, not 100%. There's some things that you might have to do that's special. For those things, you can basically interrogate and work through the configuration XML file through code. You basically treat it as nodes in an XML file. You can basically set attributes and add XML in essence to your script. But ultimately, the reason why you have to do that would be really small. Like for the most part, you can cover what you need to. It's just those extreme cases where you're using a plugin that's not 100% supported. You can still do it through the API. It's just a little different syntax that you have to sort of work through. Yes.
The library example. When you do the library, do you have to still do the non-CPS?
Yeah. So it's basically. I have an example of this. So one thing recently that this has happened to me with was reading an XML file. The JSON. Yeah. So there's a XML slurper, which is there's some operation or that itself that's not serializable. So what you can do is create a function that has non-CPS annotation, do what you have to do, and return a value that is serializable that you can work with. Like what I end up doing is taking, I read the file in, convert it to a string, and then return it. If you do that, then it'll work. What's interesting is if you want to do any kind of debugging in there, it's completely hidden from you. You can't. If you do echoes or printlns or anything they don't show up. It's basically a weird hidden method at that point. And so you won't know it necessarily worked unless you look at the result at the end, make sure it does the right thing. Another thing is like using regex. It doesn't like try to do matches on a pattern. It doesn't think that it can't handle it, so it needs to be done in a non-CPS function.
I was trying to return an array of string, but I couldn't get it to work properly.
Yeah, that's sort of tricky. You can return a list of a list is serializable, but you have to make sure that the things you're passing into it are serializable. Because sometimes when you get out information from like an XML reader, like it's a node and not a string. And so you have to make sure you understand the data type that you're working with and make sure it's serializable. Yeah?
I see that you have specified the node on top of your pipeline. Let's say if I want to run each stage in different node,
Yep.
can you do that?
Yes, absolutely. It's just using that agent and then put it in the stage definition. What people tend to do, what I do in my regular day job is I'll set that to none at the top, and then I set it and lower so that I don't want anything running on master. And I mean, something's due, like the checkout stuff I think runs. But yeah, ultimately I do change it because that's a good idea to do that, because if you have, especially if you have a long running pipeline, you have no idea how long your execution is going to be around for.
Parallelize that way too.
Yeah,
So you can have
absolutely. Yep.
slaves at the same time. Execute your slave.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So you specify a single repository, and then you specify the path of Jenkins file, right?
Mhm.
Your job configuration. So let's say I have 10 repositories, and I want to use a single C job to create 10 different jobs for each repository.
Mhm.
So how do we do that? So can DSL scan repositories directly?
Well, you wouldn't do that. So there's, what am I playing there? There's the C job itself that executes the DSL, and then there's the things that get created as a result of running the DSL, right? So the C job just says, I'm gonna do whatever you're telling me to do to the DSL. I'm gonna execute, and then those things can. So you had 4 different jobs. You just put all 4 of those in there, or you can create a C job for each one if you really wanted to narrow the focus. And then each of those seed files could reference a different Jenkins file.
On the C job, can you, instead of manually explicitly defining which Groovy files are ran, can you just do like star.groovy?
Yeah.
For all?
It sort of follows the ant style of path mattering path. Yeah, yes, you can. I would just say it depends how complex your structure is. You could inadvertently execute stuff that you're not intending to, but yeah, you do like you just do like */ star.groovy, and it would work.
Sequence is important.
It's only important if you've made it important, right? If one's dependent on another, then yeah, it would matter. It's like say you create 3 folders as your top level, but you have one of them has another internal folder. If you try to reference that one first, it will say I don't know where that folder is. So yeah. Man, I talk really fast. Any other questions? So thank you. This is my contact information.